In 1997, Camilla Parker Bowles was being cast as one of the most publicly reviled women in Britain, a symbol of betrayal, tabloid scandal, the part of the royal story the monarchy could not make disappear. Then, cut to May 2023, the same woman walks through Westminster Abbey beside King Charles III, under television lights, church music and imperial gold, not at the edge of the ceremony, at the center of it, anointed, crowned queen. That distance did not close by accident. It narrowed through timing, press management, carefully chosen appearances, and institutional signals that taught Britain to see Camilla differently. Inside Clarence House, the reported name for the project was Operation PB. One controlled image at a time, the palace tried to rebuild public memory. To follow Operation PB, the first move is separating three things: the public record, what has been reported about the strategy, and what no one outside the private circle can truly know. The public record gives fixed points: Diana's death in 1997, Mark Boleyn's arrival in Charles's household, the first managed appearance of Charles and Camilla together in 1999, the Queen's later public signals, the 2005 marriage, and the titles that carried Camilla toward the coronation. Between those fixed points is the machinery reporters later described as Operation PB: briefings, editor relationships, timing, and the slow conversion of Camilla from scandal subject into familiar public figure. That does not mean the palace controlled every headline. Fleet Street had its own incentives and appetite for royal drama, but Clarence House could choose when to offer access, when to hold back, and when to turn a private relationship into a controlled public fact. What the evidence cannot give us are private motives, bedroom conversations, or whether anyone truly forgave anyone else. They are tempting, but they are not the evidence trail. So the map widens. From Camilla to Charles's household, to the tabloid press, public anger, the Queen's authority, the church, and succession. Before that machinery could work, it had to overcome a deeper obstacle: why Camilla was seen as impossible in the first place. Before Camilla could be rehabilitated, she had to be trapped in one very damaging role. Charles and Camilla had known each other before Charles married Diana, but royal marriage was never judged only as private attachment. For the heir to the throne, marriage carried duty, image, class, religion, and succession. The future king was expected to offer the country a marriage it could read as stable, dutiful, and safe. In 1981, that expectation arrived in full ceremonial color. Diana was young, aristocratic, photogenic, and instantly legible as the fairy tale princess. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral was broadcast monarchy, a troubled institution wrapping itself in romance, pageantry, and renewal. But that image created a trap. Once Diana became the emotional face of the royal family, the breakdown of the marriage could not remain private. Every sign of distance between Charles and Diana was read against the memory of that wedding. Every report about Camilla entered the same moral frame. By the early 1990s, after separation, leaked calls, interviews, and relentless tabloid coverage, Camilla was no longer treated simply as a woman in a complicated private history. She had been assigned a public role: the intruder in the fairy tale. That role mattered because monarchy runs on symbols. A crown, a balcony, a wedding carriage, a title. These things work only if enough people accept the story around them. Diana symbolized vulnerability, glamour, and wounded honesty for millions. Camilla, fairly or unfairly, symbolized the rupture of that promise. So when people rejected Camilla, many were also defending the version of monarchy they believed Diana had represented. By 1997, that symbolic damage was about to collide with something far larger than scandal. In 1997, that collision arrived through Diana's death. When Diana died, the country did not process it as the death of a distant public figure. People came to the palace gates with flowers, notes, photographs, candles, and grief that felt personal. The space outside Buckingham Palace became a public archive of loss. Within days, grief began turning into judgment. For days, the royal family was criticized for seeming too formal, too private, too slow to meet the emotional force outside its gates. The institution that depended on symbols suddenly looked out of step with the public mood. That mattered for Charles. He was a grieving former husband and the father of 2 sons who had lost their mother. He was also the next king. Now his future reign carried a visible problem. In the public imagination, Diana's suffering and Camilla's presence had become linked. Not legally, and not as an explanation for Diana's death, but as an emotional association millions already believed they understood. Camilla was no longer just a scandal in Charles's private life, she was a constitutional optics problem. If the next king was seen as choosing the woman many blamed for Diana's unhappiness, then his judgment, popularity, and the moral story around succession were all at risk. For the palace, silence was no longer a strategy. Charles's life could not be separated from the future of the crown, and Camilla could not simply disappear from that future. Here the problem changes shape. Not just a tabloid morality play anymore, an institutional question Charles's household had to manage. The gate closes on public mourning. On the other side, a new name enters the file: Mark Boleyn. Boleyn's job was not to make the public forget Diana. That was impossible, and forcing it would have looked brutal. His job was narrower: to make Camilla less shocking each time she appeared near Charles's future. Mark Boleyn had worked in public relations before entering Charles's circle, and in 1997 he became part of the Prince of Wales's operation at the moment the old approach had failed. Reporting and later biographies describe him as one of the key figures behind what became known as Operation PB, Parker Bowles. The name sounds dramatic. The method, as later described, was slower. Change the media weather around Camilla, one small shift at a time. First, editors mattered. In Britain in the late 1990s, a handful of newspaper editors could shape whether a royal story arrived as outrage, pity, ridicule, or fact. The reported strategy was to build relationships with those editors, make access to Charles valuable, and make hostile coverage less automatic. The second lever was timing. Camilla could not be pushed forward while the country was still raw with grief. Appearances had to be spaced out. The public had to see her in contexts beyond scandal. Charity events, social occasions, carefully placed mentions, photographs that made her look less like an abstraction and more like a person beside a man who was not going to remove her from his life. That was the quiet power of repetition. Once can feel like an intrusion, again and again, under controlled conditions, begins to feel like part of the landscape. But this was crisis PR inside a monarchy. Charles was managing romance and succession. Every photograph of Camilla was also a question about the next reign. Operation PB had to soften Camilla's image for readers who knew her through hostile headlines, while reducing risk for the Queen, the Church, the government, and the rituals that would one day surround Charles as king. The campaign needed one public image, controlled enough to look intentional, ordinary enough to change the baseline. That test came in London on January 28, 1999, at the Ritz Hotel. The occasion was a birthday party for Camilla's sister. From a communications point of view, the useful part was the exit. Charles and Camilla did not appear on a palace balcony, at a formal engagement, or through a statement read by an aide. They walked out of a hotel doorway into a wall of cameras after an ordinary private celebration that had been allowed to become a public moment. The press pack was ready. Reports at the time and later accounts have described the appearances carefully managed, even choreographed. That matters because surprise was not the point. Control was. For years, the relationship had lived in headlines, leaks, moral judgment, and hostile shorthand. Here, it became a visual fact. Charles and Camilla, side by side, visible together. Not hidden in separate cars, not reduced to a quote from someone else. The image did not make her popular overnight, it changed the media baseline. After the Ritz, editors no longer had to write only around the idea of Camilla, they had the photograph. The relationship could be covered as an acknowledged public reality, not just a scandal whispered through palace gates. That is why this doorway matters. Operation PB had moved from persuasion by text to persuasion by sight. In royal image-making, sight has special force. Once the public has seen a thing happen, the next appearance is no longer the first. The Ritz exit was not the end of the campaign, it was the first successful crossing of a threshold. The tabloids had their image. But inside the monarchy, a higher gate still had to open. The tabloids had their picture. Now the crown had to decide what that picture meant. In a monarchy, publicity is not legitimacy. A softer headline can make someone less toxic. A photograph can make a relationship visible. Neither can make a future king's partner acceptable inside the institution he is supposed to inherit. That required a different kind of signal. Not a front page, not a quote from an unnamed friend. A signal from the sovereign. In June 2000, that signal arrived at Highgrove, Charles's country home in Gloucestershire. Queen Elizabeth II attended a lunch there where Camilla was also present. We do not need to imagine the room or invent what anyone said. The public fact carried the message. The Queen had chosen to be in the same social setting as Camilla, at Charles's home, in a way that could be reported and understood. At the time, it was widely read as a major step. Not a declaration of affection, not a promise of marriage, but tacit acceptance. The woman once treated as impossible to acknowledge was being allowed into the royal frame. This is where Operation PB stops looking like a campaign aimed only at newspapers and starts looking like a campaign aimed upward, toward the institution itself. The press work had created room. The Ritz photograph had made the couple visible. Highgrove suggested something heavier. Camilla was no longer just a media problem to contain. She was becoming someone the monarchy could manage. Public opinion could remain mixed. Diana's memory had not disappeared. But institutions do not always wait for complete emotional consensus. They look for enough room to move without cracking the institution around them. By 2000, the palace had found that space. Once the Queen's presence opened that gate, the next question became harder to avoid. If Camilla could be accepted beside Charles socially, could she be accepted beside him legally, religiously, and eventually by title? That question pushed the palace into territory where symbolism was no longer enough. A photograph could normalize Camilla. A lunch with the Queen could signal acceptance, but marriage meant law, church, succession, and titles had to line up without making the crown look as if it had abandoned its own standards. So in 2005, Charles and Camilla did not marry in a grand royal wedding at St. George's Chapel. They married in a civil ceremony at Windsor Guildhall, a town hall setting rather than a church altar, with the Queen not attending that legal ceremony. Afterward, they went to St. George's Chapel for a service of prayer and dedication, led by the Archbishop of Canterbury. The format carried the message. Both Charles and Camilla were divorced. Charles was also the future Supreme Governor of the Church of England. The solution was not to pretend the religious problem did not exist. It was to separate the legal marriage from the church blessing, then surround the event with repentance, prayer, and institutional continuity. The title was handled with the same caution. When Camilla married Charles, she became legally Princess of Wales, but she did not use that title because it was still emotionally inseparable from Diana. Instead, she was styled Duchess of Cornwall. The palace indicated that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known not as queen, but as princess consort. That was the compromise. Move her inside the institution, but do not yet ask the country to place her in Diana's most emotionally charged symbolic space. Then, in February 2022, Queen Elizabeth II changed the weight of that compromise. In her Accession Day message, she said it was her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. This was not a tabloid trial balloon. It was the sovereign, near the end of her reign, lending authority to the final title. When Elizabeth died later that year, Camilla became Queen Consort. At the coronation in 2023, the wording shortened in public view. Beside Charles, under the music, robes, oil, and ancient choreography, she was crowned queen. By then, the path from Duchess to Princess Consort to Queen Consort to Queen no longer looked like one sudden leap. It looked like a staircase, built one careful compromise at a time. Seen as a sequence, Camilla's crown stops looking like one sudden act of forgiveness. It looks like the endpoint of a long campaign in which each step made the next one less impossible. First came visibility, the Ritz doorway, The flashbulbs, Charles and Camilla standing together in public. Then came repetition until the same image became less startling. Then came institutional signals. The Queen at Highgrove, the civil wedding at Windsor, and the prayer service that gave the marriage a place inside the church without pretending the controversy had never existed. Then came title management, holding back the word Queen until the institution judged that the country could bear it. Operation PB did not erase Diana, the anger of the 1990s, or the sense of betrayal many people still attach to this story. It changed the public conditions around Camilla until formal acceptance could arrive before emotional resolution. That is what the coronation finally made official. Not that everyone had forgiven, not that the past had been settled, but that the crown had survived the contradiction by turning time, ceremony, and repetition into legitimacy. The monarchy's oldest skill is not standing still, it is bending, just enough to remain recognizable. In Camilla's crown, you can see the cost of that survival, a country taught over 26 years to remember differently.